Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today from the Tar Heel State is my friend Derrick Brown. Derrick, how are you tonight?
I'm well, and yourself tonight?
I'm even better now that you're hanging out with me. So,
Well, thank you, sir.
yeah, absolutely. Derrick is the operations manager at the Bentonville Battlefield, Bentonville State Historic Site. And I got to ask you, so, like you had a big 160th anniversary. Have you recovered?
Finally just took a vacation. Had a lot of leave built up from working plenty of extra hours with the event. So just took a long vacation. As we were discussing earlier, I instead of going somewhere fun, we were doing home improvement stuff. So tomorrow's my first day back to work. I need to go back to work so I can rest now.
You
Uh,
need a vacation from your
Yeah,
vacation.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, it was a very well attended event. We had but sadly the weather intervened on Sunday of the reenactment weekend. But on Saturday we had nearly 30,000 people show up, and people, Bentonville is the largest reenactment in North Carolina. We typically only do it every 5 years. We missed 2020 because of COVID, of course. So there was a lot of anticipation, people wanting to see another battle reenactment again, and that's the best way to get 30,000 people to Bentonville. I would say that's the most since 1865, but the 150th we had over 60,000 for the weekend.
Wow.
But that was the most since March of 1865.
Yeah. But 30,000, like, I mean, like you've got to consider that to be a pretty big
Oh,
success.
absolutely, absolutely. We were, um, you know, I would have taken so we were disappointed naturally that Sunday had to be canceled, but I mean it was severe, heavy winds. Even if we hadn't canceled, the reenactors were not staying in the woods overnight with the weather like it was. So the reenactors canceled for us, even if we hadn't prudently done it ourselves. So it just couldn't happen on Sunday. But there was as many people there on Saturday as I had kind of cautiously hoped for the entire weekend. So it's hard to be very upset. Saturday, it went really well.
And talking to you last fall as you were starting the preparations, which I guess, had actually started well before that. But when you and I
Mhm.
were talking, you're like talking about like rows of porta potties and figuring out the logistics of parking.
Yes.
I mean, you were really expecting a horde of people to descend upon what you guys did. Um,
Yeah.
and you pulled off a fantastic event. Everybody I've talked to that attended was just like wowed by what you guys were able to pull off
Yeah.
with your staff.
Yeah, it makes you feel good because there is a lot of hours that go into it. And it is one of those things that you start your initial planning almost 2 years in advance, at least a year and a half, or you're behind the eight ball. Um, because you need to recruit reenactors, you need to get all that, and you need to start getting the word out there. And with us not having 2020, we were a little bit, we were a little bit nervous whether people were going to come. We figured it would go either way, that people would come out in droves because they missed seeing one, or people had forgotten about Bentonville reenactments. But we found out by mid-morning on that Saturday that people hadn't forgot, because I looked up and there was a lot of folks there, a lot of folks. And as you know, Bentonville's not logistically friendly for thousands and thousands of folks to be there. I mean, and Sherman found that out. Sherman didn't want to stay at Bentonville any longer than he had to, because he's going to have to feed his army. Well, we had to feed an army of 30,000 people there, and you're I think we had somewhere around a dozen food trucks. Wasn't enough. There's all these small logistical things that we try to learn from each time, and then 5 years down the road we try to improve. But once again, other than the weather on Sunday, overall things could not have gone better.
Yeah. And like, I just want to give a shout out to what you guys do because I mean, as a state historic site, like you guys are first class. It's a beautiful battlefield. And we're going to talk a little bit about that
Yeah,
tonight on our podcast, but a beautiful battlefield. It's well interpreted. You guys have great trails, great signage. I mean, it's really a first class place to visit.
yeah. Well, we thank you for saying that. It's been years and years, years and years. Really the past 50 years has been, well, I would say the past 50 years, but sadly, it's only been really the past 20 to 25 years has been acquire the property. And now in the past really 10 years, it's been now that we have the property, let's do something with it. Let's interpret it. And, we have a 14-mile driving tour, which includes a 10-mile loop. There's 10 tour stops. There's cell phone narration for parts of that done by Dr. Mark Bradley, who's the foremost expert on the Carolinas campaign. And then if you include loops in our partnership with the North Carolina Mountains to Sea Trail, we're approaching 8 miles of walking trails now.
Oh, wow. And you
Yeah,
guys have a relatively new walking trail that gets
yeah,
down into the bullpen.
yeah. It's something I never thought I would get to see. In my tenure at Bentonville, and I've been at Bentonville since 2006 now, and so it's been 19 years this year, and the bullpen was one of those mythical areas that I had been to, but part of it was crawling, literally crawling, because the terrain was so terrible. Um, um, the previous owners had a pine tree operation in there. It was essentially a pine plantation, um, and they had ridged up the ground, which got the pines out of the swamp that was the bullpen. But it made it very terrible for being able to navigate. But this partnership with the North Carolina Mountains to Sea Trail, they have trail expertise, and they have methods of getting grants, and they were able to employ a professional trail builder who was able to bust right through those burns and get us to Morgan's Line, in the bullpen, an area of well preserved. I say a well preserved. They are well preserved trenches that you wouldn't know were trenches unless you knew they were trenches, because Morgan only had about an hour to dig in, and much of Morgan's trenches were piling dirt, piling mud on top of fallen trees and things like that. So there is a discernible trench, but once again, you wouldn't know that if you didn't know there was a battle there. And we are very fortunate that the landowners, I was just saying they put a pine plantation, but they always made a point of marking off those trenches, and we kind of knew where they were. If you looked at a Google Earth satellite view, you could see where the foliage changed, and it was hardwoods where the trenches are, the same type of trees which would have been there in 1865, uh, surrounded by pine, and that hardwood, it really stood out on a satellite map, and so it kind of gave us a basis of what we were going to be looking for to install the trail, and we're super happy about it now.
And I'll give a shout out to your colleague Dominic Schilling, who's the one who pointed me down there for the first
Mm-hmm.
time shortly after the trail opened up. And when I first walked down there, the rows that had been created for the tree farm
Yeah,
really kind of confused the landscape because they
that's
sort
right.
of look like earthworks. And I was like, I think this is a tree, but it could have been. And so having
Yeah,
that trail marking and that interpretation really makes a huge difference.
yeah, and it was extremely difficult when you're in there, before the trails in there. It's extremely difficult because I took Bart Dunkley and I went back in there a couple of years ago before the trail was done, and we walked all over. And I've been in there to the trenches before, but it had been years before. And we walked all over and around looking for the trench line, but those burns really messed us up, and we eventually found it. Um, but those but when you're in there and you see those berms, and there's not a definable trail, yeah, it's awfully confusing. And it really led us to maybe getting really close to a Union Reserve line, that we thought was a berm, but is actually possibly trench line. But luckily, we didn't go right on it. We went next to it.
Now, for folks who don't know the story of Bentonville, we're all excited about the bullpen. Maybe they
Yeah.
don't know what the bullpen is. Briefly explain to us, like, why is this area so particularly important for the battlefield overall?
Yeah. So the bullpen at Bentonville was some of the nastiest hand to hand at times, close quarters fighting in thick terrain, underbrush, think the wilderness type terrain. The Confederates were able to get right up on the second division of the 14th Army Corps, which is Morgan's division, James Data Morgan's division, and those guys, the Confederates were right on them when they launched they let off a rebel yell, and it was nasty fighting, touch and go thing. But Morgan's men were able to hold the ground, and as they were celebrating, they start hearing a rebel yell and bullets whizzing from behind them. Another Confederate attack had gotten behind Morgan's line. And so that's the reason the area starts to become known as the bullpen, because they were surrounded on three sides by Confederates and then an impassable swamp to the south. So Confederates to the north, east, and west, and an impassable swamp to the south. And we call the area Morgan's Stand because Morgan was able to hold the ground. Morgan was not a professionally West Point trained officer. He had Mexican War experience. He was going to do exactly what his corps commander told him to do. His corps commander was the guy with the unfortunate name Jefferson C. Davis. Um, and Davis told Morgan to find the right of the first division and hold the line. Morgan, who probably should have retreated because he was about to be surrounded, winds up sacrificing one of his brigades to hold the ground in a spoiling attack. But he does what he's asked. He's not a very imaginative guy. He's told to hold the ground. He's going to hold the ground, and that really made the Confederate assault on March 19th, the first day of the battle. That's when the wheels start coming off the Confederate assault, which up to that point, call it late afternoon, March 19th, things have gone really well for the Confederates. Surprise was on their side, and Morgan's stand really starts to change things.
It's one of those instances where things are all going pretty well for the Confederates, and then suddenly dot dot
Yeah,
dot.
you're right, absolutely. Morgan buys time. Morgan stand by time for more of the left wing. Sherman's, people who are not familiar with Bentonville, they may know that it was part of Sherman's march. Sherman wasn't there on March 19th. Sherman is with his right wing about anywhere from at times 6 miles away to about 12, maybe about 12 miles away. And so it's the left wing commanded by Henry Warner Slocum who really fights the battle on March 19th. Now, Joseph Johnson, who he's fighting, is only able to form an army of about 20,000 men. And Slocum himself, if you use rough figures, has somewhere pushing 30,000. So one wing of Sherman's command outnumbers the Confederates, but the Confederates had surprise on their side. Their cavalry commander, Wade Hampton, had picked a great spot for an ambush. Sherman's cavalry commander, Judson Kilpatrick, wasn't doing a very great job. And that's probably not a shock to many people. And he's given Sherman faulty information that the Confederates have fallen back to Raleigh. And that's going to allow this ambush to happen. And like we said, up through mid to late afternoon on March 19th, the Confederates really had their way. But Morgan's Stand is the first time that the Confederate plan really starts to unravel. But the Confederates really managed to rout. They managed to rout an entire Federal division earlier in the battle. But William Passmore Carlin's division, which is the first division in the 14th Corps, but Morgan's division is really able to hold, and somehow able to hold, and that really kind of starts to turn the tide of battle.
And Joe Johnson's one of those guys. He's sort of easy to make fun of today in retrospect. Oh, he's
Mhm.
falling back. He's falling back.
Yes.
One of Johnson's whole philosophies was like, look for an opportunity where conditions finally favor his outnumbered
Yeah.
army to attack. Bentonville is one of those examples that he was always looking for, where
Yeah.
he's got an opportunity that he finally sees, and he's going to take that opening.
Absolutely. He has kind of tough marching orders from Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee's finally general in chief, very end of the war. Lee is the one who personally wants Johnson out of retirement. Johnson doesn't want the job because he thinks he's being set up as a fall guy for the war ending scapegoat. But once he hears that it's his old friend Lee who asked for him back, he agrees to take the job. But he says there's really nothing I can do. Why don't I just form this army? Why don't I start to gather this force, and why don't I come up and join you? And Lee said, if you do that, we will both starve. You have to stay down there in North Carolina and slow Sherman down. And Lee tells him, strike him a blow. Um, Perhaps a bold and unexpected attack will really, save us. And then at the end, though, he says, oh, by the way, don't get your army destroyed because that's not doing us any favors either. And so those are really tough marching orders for Johnston. And Johnston has Wade Hampton, who the very able cavalry commander, looking for a place to ambush part of Sherman's command. Um, as we were talking about earlier, logistics in Bentonville, feeding. It was tough for us to try to have enough food trucks to feed 30,000 people back on March 15th. That's why Sherman isn't marching on a single road. That's why his command isn't together. And I purposely say command because he really commands two armies at this point. He's going to command a third army once he can make it to Goldsboro. So we would call that an army group, during the Second World War or something like that. But um, so Sherman can't keep them in one area because he's having to live off the land, and so Johnson's only hope is to fight an isolated detachment, and that isolated detachment just happened to be the left wing, which is naturally going to be the more vulnerable wing because it's marching further inland than the right wing. Sherman knew that. Sherman also his guard really went up when Johnston was called back because Sherman respected Johnston. Um, but as he approached Goldsboro and Johnson hadn't made a more serious stand than Hardee's brief exchange at Aversboro on even March 15th, but really March 16th. Other than that, um, there hadn't been much Confederate opposition. Sherman's really kind of holding the Confederates in contempt. He doesn't hold Johnson in contempt, but he's starting to think Johnson didn't have enough time to really put up an adequate defense. And so Sherman's going to let his guard down at the last second, and he's going to ride off and join the right wing because he wants to be there when the right wing makes contact with the reinforcements coming up from the coast. And so him letting his guard down, it does allow the left wing to kind of march into this trap, and Slocum and his subordinates are really kind of following, are listening to Sherman that there's nothing in front of you except for Confederate cavalry and junior reserves, maybe senior reserves. Brush them aside, and I'll meet you at Cox's Bridge, which is the bridge just before the armies reached Goldsboro, which is Sherman's destination. Many people don't really realize Sherman. Even people who live in Eastern North Carolina don't necessarily think of Goldsboro as the most strategically important town today. Um, but Sherman pointed to Goldsboro when he leaves Georgia because Goldsboro is going to be where Union detachments in New Bern, Beaufort, and Morehead City, an area that the Union Army had captured in 1862, could reinforce him using the railroad to Goldsboro. And then Fisher, Fort Fisher is going to fall in January, and Wilmington in February, which is another fort that is going to be connected to Goldsboro via railroad. And so if Sherman can get to Goldsboro, he's going to be well supplied by the Union Navy and not have to worry as much about living off the land anymore. So that's why Goldsboro was the key. And they think that Johnston kind of knows that. He tried to make a stand at Fayetteville first, um, to oppose Sherman's crossing of the Cape Fear River. He just didn't have enough time to form his forces because his command is just this hodgepodge, widely separated guys.
He's got like a bunch of scraps that are left over from
Yeah,
1864, right?
yeah. I mean, I would, and I hate to use that term, but you're probably right. I mean, that's the best way of saying it. Um, there's there are veterans. There's the colonel. There's the colonel of the Army of Tennessee. The guys who are back in Tupelo when they start boarding the railroad to start heading east. Eventually, about 10,000 of those guys are going to make it to North Carolina. Only 4,500 will make it to North Carolina in time to fight on March 19th. Before the battle's over, another couple thousand of them will reach Bentonville on the third day of the battle. Um, so there's the Army of Tennessee veterans. Then you have Robert F. Hoke's division of North Carolinians, which had been sent by Lee to keep Fort Fisher from falling. But at the last minute, Confederate President Davis detaches his military advisor to accompany that division, of course, none other than General Braxton Bragg, down to Wilmington. And as the Richmond paper says, Bragg goes to Wilmington, goodbye, Wilmington. So Hoke, so Lee's so outnumbered at Petersburg, yet he realizes how important Wilmington is because that is his lifeline. He's going to detach a relatively full strength division to North Carolina, Robert F. Hoke's division, and those guys never even really engage during the battles for Fort Fisher. And so more or less those guys are wasted. They're not helpful for Lee. They're not helpful for Bragg. But eventually they're going to get folded under Johnston's command, and Bragg's going to get folded under Johnston's command, much to Bragg's embarrassment. But Davis tells Bragg more or less, you have to suck it up right now. And then there's going to be more reserve type troops, red infantry, former heavy artillerists who no longer have forts. Guess what? You're in the infantry now. And so all that together, plus the cavalry detachment, which is the best thing Johnston has going for him. So it's Butler's division from the AMV, Matthew Butler, who's under really the personal command of Wade Hampton, who gets permission from Lee to go down to South Carolina to see what he could do about Sherman. And then Hampton was Lee's cavalry commander after the death of Stuart. So that's kind of a big deal. And
no slouch.
yeah, right, exactly. And then Joe Wheeler, Wheeler's guys from the Army of Tennessee, and they do this finagling where they rush to go and make Hampton a lieutenant general really quickly before Wheeler can get there. So technically Hampton outranks Wheeler. But that's the thing Johnston has going for him is this cavalry command, and it's doing a wonderful job. Whereas we kind of hit on Kilpatrick, Sherman didn't really pick him because of his prowess on the battlefield or anything like that. Sherman's quote was, "Kilpatrick is a hell of a damned fool, but he's just the type of guy I want for this type of operation." Because Sherman wants him because he's going to be more of a thorn in the side of Confederate civilian versus his prowess on the battlefield. And that's almost going to really, I mean, it does come back to bite him, especially if you're one of those 1,600 Union casualties on March 19th, not March 19th, but 1,600 during the battle, 1,527 to be exact. But it really, it could have cost Sherman the battle itself because, if except for, of course, as you said earlier, this is just another one of those battles where things go well for the Confederates early on, and they start unraveling.
That could be the story of the Confederate military history.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely right. Microcosm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and aside from just all this great battle stuff, I mean, one of the things that I think is really important in the work that you've done, and kind of why I wanted to sort of debrief after the reenactment, was like you have a fantastic book about the history of the battlefield. So, like after all this military action takes place, what's left behind has a history of its own over the last 160 years. You've got a great book that's part of the Images of America series,
Hmm.
Bentonville Battlefield State Historic Site, that you co-wrote with your former colleague Colby Gaines, and so it chronicles like what happens in the aftermath of all of this stuff. What
Yeah.
did you decide to tell the story of the battlefield?
Yeah.
Hmm.
As I said, earlier, Mark Bradley and others, there's other very prominent writers who are still writing about the Carolinas campaign today. Wade Sokolowski, for one. Um, you know, um, Nat Hughes had written about Bentonville in the '90s as well. Um, so, um, so there's several. So the battle has been mostly covered, but um, Bentonville, of course, Bentonville is an important place to us, and unlike many other places where the Civil War was fought, Bentonville kind of seemed to be forgotten about for a long time. Um, I think a lot of that is when it happened. Um, it's it's towards the end of March 1865. You're about to go into April 1865, which many people, someone could, and many people have argued is probably the most tumultuous month in the history of this country. And so the events of March kind of get forgotten about a little bit, and Bentonville kind of gets caught up in that. The area is super isolated, and I kind of say that present tense still too, but it was, you can imagine how isolated it was in 1865. So unlike Gettysburg, which seems like it had tourists starting July 4th, 1863, right? Bentonville is kind of forgotten about. The veterans of the battle, though, didn't. Many of the veterans compare it to Chickamauga, because more so because the terrain, surprise. Um, Really, it's especially those Army of Tennessee veterans and the 14th Corps veterans on the federal side who were roughly handled at Chickamauga, and many of those guys are roughly handled at Bentonville as well. Um, so it really stood out to them, but there's no major effort really for 30. A group comes over in the 1890s and puts up a monument to Confederate dead. Um, the Union dead had been moved in 1867 to what is now Raleigh National Cemetery. And that monument, 1895, and then that monument more or less is just kind of sit fallow for a long time. Brush grows up over top of it. There's no public land or anything like that to be able to really commemorate the battle. There starts to be a push, though, from state leaders to get Bentonville made a national military park in the 19 starts in the 19 late 20s and really goes into the 30s. In fact, the MPS actually sends a gentleman to Bentonville named his name is Ralston Lattimore, and he comes and he says Bentonville be a perfect national park. We could set up a driving tour there. We could never afford all the property. It is in the middle of the Great Depression, of course. Um, and um, and it looks like there's momentum to have this happen. And then all of a sudden, the calendar turns into 1940, then to 1941, and all of a sudden, there's other things for the federal government to worry about. And for whatever reason, that momentum does not pick up again after World War II. And um, so it's really the local community who really preserved what Bentonville is today. The locals really did that because there was no one else to do it. The miles of trenches we have, and all that, and all that stuff. We just really thought it was a remarkable story that people look at Bentonville as this place that looks so much like it did in 1865. Well, that was, at least from the outside looking in, that was more of an accident than any defined plan. Um, but I wouldn't say it was an accident are the local folks, because the local people are the ones who preserve the property. I was talking about earlier with the bullpen. If those local folks hadn't preserved that trench line, hadn't roped it off, the timberers who were in there with the pine plantation would have utterly destroyed those trenches. So um, so luckily the folks of Bentonville took pride in their area. They knew something important had happened there. And so it's not until the 1950s that the state of North Carolina finally, 1957, when they purchased um, what was the first areas of Bentonville Battlefield. And ironically, where they purchased wasn't even Battlefield itself. It was behind the line. And
Wow.
I kind of like to say it was Bentonville battleground, but it was a battleground without a battlefield. It was the area around the Harper House, and the Harper House was super important, which was a field hospital during the battle.
Yeah.
But it was, anywhere depending on the 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 day, it was anywhere from a mile to about 3 miles behind Union Line, and um, so it's really there's going to be a couple satellite purchases, in the 1990s, but it's really with the advent of what is now the American Battlefield Trust, circa 2000, and since then that the battlefield itself has been able to be as preserved as it is now. And we're somewhere around 2,400 acres, somewhere 20 pushing 2,500 acres of the 6,000 total that's been estimated that the battlefield covered, the core area of the battlefield. And so and that's all really been, shouldn't say all, it's mostly been a 21st century thing. But if the locals had not preserved Bentonville as well as they've had for years and years, and years, we wouldn't be able to interpret it like we do now.
And you have told me that the local landowners have been key partners in like battlefield acquisition, preservation. Like they understand the resource that they've been
Yeah,
stewards of and have been really good partners for you guys.
absolutely. They're many of them. Their ancestors lived on the battlefield during the battle. Many of them, um, and it's a it's an agricultural it's an agricultural community, and the land is super important when it comes to agricultural areas like that. The land is very important to people, and people do not want to see it developed, and they know that if they sell to the American Battlefield Trust, the area is going to be preserved forever. And they also know in many cases that their children, not always, but most of the time, their children have no interest in being farmers. They are going to go off to college and move away, and so it's just a win-win for everybody. And the American Battlefield Trust donates the property to the state of North Carolina, and we then lease it back to the farmers, which keeps agriculture on the battlefield, keeps it, and it makes the farmers happy as well.
Yeah. And I remember being with you out in one of the cotton fields out on the battlefield, and you're like, "Take a look at this. There's no little round top. There's no devil.
Yeah,
It's flat. Here's like a little rise in the middle of the field kind of thing."
yeah.
That landscape and being able to see it and understand it is really key to understanding the battle.
It is. I still envy those folks who can point at a hill and really see it's a hill. I envy those folks when they are doing battlefield tours at other places. Um, but um, but it is important to be able to see it. It's important because Bentonville's hard. Bentonville's a hard battle to understand. Bentonville is very complicated, and I think a lot of that is like we were talking about, the hodgepodge nature of these various units. Um, and it's spread out, and it's really hard to grasp. I can go and do off-site programs to heritage groups, to roundtables and all that, but I always tell them, to really understand the battle, you need to be able to get there, and because we can roughly point to the Confederate position of March 19th, and like I said, there's probably rough estimate somewhere around 3 miles of trenches remaining. We don't have all those. We have most of them. So you can literally see the line. There's visual evidence that the fighting happened here, and so and being able to point to that makes a difference. Um, and the lack of terrain is a terrain feature in itself. If this is what you can see, this is what they could see in 1865.
Yeah, and one of the I think really key parts of the battlefield, and maybe it's sort of understated, but the first time I ever really saw a field of cotton on a battlefield was at Bentonville, and it was right
Yeah,
across the street from where the visitor center is.
yeah,
And for me, that was just like a really poignant reminder, like this is what it was all about. When like when you think about it,
yeah,
like cotton
yeah,
is kind of the one of the driving forces behind slavery and economic
for
might.
sure,
And like, and to me, that was and there was no sign about it, but it was just like to stand there and be like, wow, wow,
for
this is,
sure.
you know?
Yeah, for sure. But then I have to tell people that people are looking at cotton across the field and say, well, cotton wasn't really grown here that much in 1865 or 1860. We do have a few census records mentioning about a little bit of cotton. Um, it was kind of far. It was kind of far north for cotton at that time without fertilizer. Without some of the phosphates and things like they start mining after the war for or guano or whatever they use. I'm definitely not a farmer, but um, it was it was tough that, and it wasn't really tobacco land either. That's going to be like a 1880s, 1890s things. Cotton's really going to take off 1880s, 1890s. So what was it? Trying to tell people that the cash crop were trees.
Yeah.
People are like, what? But the longleaf pine trees, which is difficult for us to try to explain to folks because there's just so few of them around because they were over harvested. But those big longleaf pine trees, which were super thinned out, so armies could navigate around them. It wasn't like they're fighting in a forest all the time. Um, but these thinned out naval stores. You started off saying I'm joining you from the Tar Heel State. Well, naval stores was Bentonville's cash crop, turpentine trade. The turpentine,
Turpentine,
yeah, trade, and Bentonville had a turpentine distillery, which is set fire in the aftermath of battle. And I would argue, I don't know who I'm with, but I would argue that Bentonville, that the village of Bentonville never recovered because of the burning of that turpentine distillery. Because when you set a turpentine distillery on fire, it's not just going to be the turpentine distillery. There's a carriage shop next to it, and what are carriages made out of? I mean, it just the village never really recovers. And Bentonville was a thriving economic. It had a business district, which people look at us like we have two heads when we say that now, because but like that Bentonville was a little thriving village that just never recovers from the battle. In fact, I think we made the point in the book. Colby and I made the point in the book that the battle even changes the name of the place because it was Bentonville.
huh?
It was Bentonville for years and years and years. It was Bentonville, and then I really feel like it was veterans of the battle calling it Bentonville, and eventually Bentonville wins out over Bentonville. But on all local all local sources till probably 1920ish or so, it's always Bentonville. Um,
Huh?
so, but yeah. So we have cotton now, and the cotton was kind of sparse, and North Carolina was a little bit different. Um, of course, slavery was widespread in North Carolina, just like it was across the South, but it was much more dispersed. You have fewer of the large stereotypical classical Southern plantations in North Carolina, with exceptions, of course, especially on the coast. Um, than you have in the deeper South. People like the Harpers who enslaved three people in 1860. The people who had the Harper House, which becomes a hospital. That's much more typical in North Carolina than the large plantations like you see in the Delta, Mississippi Delta, or the seacoast of South Carolina, like the Santee area.
Right.
Yeah,
One of the other things I think is really fascinating about your battlefield is not far from the visitor center is sort of a collection of monuments. So there's sort of like this, it's almost like a designated commemorative area. And then
yeah,
there's a cemetery for unknown Confederate dead. And as you said, that's all behind Union lines at the time. How,
yeah.
how did that area develop over time?
Well, it was kind of that thing. It developed there by default because the Harpers. So the Harpers, of course, it's a Union hospital, 14th Corps hospital. There, when the battle ends, Sherman's going to have all of his wounded loaded up and continue with the march to Goldsboro. But the Union surgeons had treated a number of Confederates there. Someone transposed the numbers at some point over the years. It was either 45 or 54. I would lean towards 54. Confederates were treated by Federal surgeons at the Harper House. And I say at least 54 because the ones who were walking wounded, ambulatory wounded, would have probably been marched off as prisoners of war. But these are ones who couldn't be marched off. The Union surgeons had treated them capably. The Harper family is then they're just left with the Harper family, and a Confederate scout finds them, sends a message back to headquarters. Braxton Bragg, in fact, eventually sends an order for someone to come and get them. According to family sources, though, that never happened, and they just start heading home as they're able. Well, 23 of those 54 die there in the Harper's care in the weeks and months afterwards, and somewhere on the property, or perhaps even where they are right now, the Harpers interred them somewhere on their own property. We know that three of them were local and taken home for burial, um, leaving a total of 20. And that cemetery area was that colonel that the Goldsboro Rifles, who were best way to describe them is like if you mix a National Guard unit with a Rotary Club, you would get the Goldsboro Rifles. It was a social club, but it was still a National Guard, a state guard unit that actually deploys to Cuba in 1898. So it is a military group, but as a social project, they take on raising funds to take over the cemetery from the Harpers and to move all Confederates off the battlefield to this area donated by the Harper family, which once again happens to just be behind Union lines. Um, and so that's where everything kind of sprung up. And so that monument was dedicated March 20th, 1895. It says 360 Confederates are buried here. Here, kind of a large place apparently, because we've had archaeology there. We even had the History Channel filming a special, Save Our History special. It was probably 2008 or 2009. I've been at Bentonville just a couple of years. Steve Thomas from This Old House hosted, and we had ground penetrating radar there to archaeologists, and we found nothing that looked anything remotely like a mass grave. But they did find things that looked like individual graves, and which really kind of made sense because that meant that that's likely the guys from the Harper House.
Wow.
And so the local UDC stepped in and purchased grave markers, unknown Confederate dead grave markers. Of course, the federal government would get grave markers even for Confederate soldiers, but it's the unknown part that was the problem. And we have a list of names, or approximate list of names. It's like someone played a game of telephone with those names though over the years, and they get garbled. But even if those names were completely accurate, we wouldn't know who's buried in each plot, in each spot. And so that monument went up in 1895, and then the historic site starts with the purchase of the Harper House in '57. A visitor center is built adjacent to the Harper House in '64, and has the grand opening for the centennial March of '65, and that's just where everything was. Now there are there was a reserve Union line, reserve trenches, the extreme Union left, which is adjacent to probably 500, 600 yards from the monument area, but there wasn't any fighting in that area. I always tell folks on tour, I always say it was a last ditch, so to speak, and I get a lot of glazed over look. So it's my horrible attempt to have humor, but it was trenches that were dug but weren't really used, and so that area, like I said, it's just Union controlled area, but really, uh, starting in the '90s, there was a satellite purchase of a portion of the Army of Tennessee line, where they were located March 19th through the 21st, so all 3 days of the battle, which includes some very impressive trenches, a revetment log, or at least one, possibly as many as three revetment logs, which are likely Willis Cole, who owned the plantation where this trench is located. It was likely Mr. Cole's fence rail,
Mhm.
which was taken down by Confederate soldiers, thrown in a trench, and then dirt piled up on top, and to reinforce the trench. And these are very impressive trenches because the Confederates were there for 3 days. They're they have these are laid out by engineers perfectly straight. This isn't a haphazard thing like Morgan's line on March 19th, where they have 1 hour to dig, and it's all like that because they don't have time to worry about these nice straight lines. So so that was kind of the first foray onto the battlefield proper. But like I said, like I said earlier, most of that stuff been since 2000, and I've gotten in hot water with some of my friends from Gettysburg, from saying this, but I like I like that the monuments are really sequestered to a single area. I'm a lot of people are monument folks, and that's a very fine opinion to have. I'm not really one. To me, I think sometimes it it hurts the viewshed, hurts the landscape. And are those monuments to the people that are on the monument, or are they to the people who put the monument up? But things like that. Um, so I'm not a huge monument person, but that's just my opinion. That's not the opinion of Bentonville Battlefield State Historic Site or the state of North Carolina. Um, but so I like that they're in one area. People can go and see all the monuments in a single area. There's some really cool, if you like monuments, these are really cool, especially that Gold Bar Rifles monument, the 1895 monument, things like that. I really enjoy. But you don't have to worry about looking around that monument to be able to see on the battlefield. Now, there's one exception. The UDC in the 1927, I think it was, put a monument to the North Carolina Junior Reserves right in the center of the Confederate line. But
Right.
it's a very very modest stone there, and it really fits well where it's located. But I kind of like the way, of course I'm partial to Bentonville, but I kind of like the way and I mean it was none of my doing, but what we've inherited was a dedicated monument area.
Now I've got to ask, you can reserve opinion if you want, but right next to state property is private property where Joe Johnston has a statue, and then kind
Yeah,
of adjacent to that is a horse's head that's a monument to
yeah.
horses. Um, any opinions on that you'd like to share? And as I said,
Uh,
plead the fifth if you'd like.
so so that property, what I can share is that especially the horse's head, some of the monument, and there's another monument or two right there. One of our neighbors, Larry LaBoda, owns property there, and he's been a Bentonville enthusiast. He he moved from Long he moved from Long Island because he fell in love with the battlefield, and he's been a Bentonville enthusiast and a student of the battle for a long, long time. And so those things there are tastefully done. The Johnston Monument, it is unique because it's only one of two, I think, Johnston monuments.
Right.
One of them being in Georgia. But that one's unique. It just happens to be located once again, like all the other monuments, behind Union lines.
So yeah, it's a place where Johnson actually wasn't, but it's a place where a property owner was like, "Hey, I want to have a
Yeah,
statue of Johnson."
absolutely right. Right.
And like I like the horse monument only because people don't think about that
Oh
aspect of
yeah.
war that often. But horses are the engines that drive the armies, and to have something that
Yeah.
like that's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And and you even think about, and they've written about, people have written about this, like Gettysburg, for instance. Um, think about all the dead animals in the aftermath, and someone's burying, someone's having to bury them or do something with them, and um, you know, uh, yeah, I mean, it's just part of the horrors that would have been there on the battlefield, just when the battle's over. I mean, it's still horrors, that are there on the field, whether that was locals having to do it or the armies themselves. We do know that the Union Army buried both sides dead. What I would love to find, is, um, seems like there had to been records and maps somewhere or something, because they know where these Union soldiers are buried to move them to Raleigh in 1867. So that's kind of my next project one day, when I have when there's some free time, is to try to figure out, how they knew where this cemetery was. Is there a long lost map floating around in National Archives somewhere or something? Because that would be really cool. We've had um, Bentonville was really really very heavily relic hunted in the years before it became state property, and there's pros and cons of that. But there's at least a handful of them they were students of the battle, and they kept records where they found things. And one of them, he recently told us he found a bayonet that had been melted into a hook, which was probably likely for moving bodies to bury them. And so the Union Army buried the Confederate dead as well. And if they cared enough to mark them, they couldn't mark them because they don't know who these guys are. And let's be honest, they probably didn't care much to mark them either. And so the so it would have been a super tall task in 1895 for that group from Goldsboro to actually find these guys on the battlefield who are buried in unmarked graves. Locals would have known where some of them are, I'm sure, but to be able to find them and move them, 30 years later, I mean, 1867 is bad enough, but 1895, having to find guys in unmarked graves. But yeah, I mean, it's super fascinating because the government, the military occupiers, of Raleigh, the government in Raleigh, the federal army pays contractors, and it's government low bid work to come and find those Union dead in 1867. So how thorough of a job did they do for low bid contract work to actually move those? So what I'm getting at is there may be even remnants of a Union cemetery at Bentonville, what's left of it, that we have no idea, where. We've had archaeology all around the Harper House, kind of like the logical places, and we haven't stumbled upon anything, but I hope to one day.
Wow, wow.
Yeah,
So, let me just ask you, Donnie Taylor, one of your predecessors, kind of a legend in North
yeah,
Carolina, Bentonville history, did a lot to kind of help shape the earlier development of the battlefield. Um, any comment about the legacy that Donnie left behind that you sort of
yeah.
inherit?
Yeah, well, Donnie hired me in 2006, and I worked for Donnie up until he retired in 2018. And Many of those battlefield successes, many of those partnerships were really because of Donnie, because um, Donnie himself grew up super interested in Civil War, but he wasn't. He didn't go to college and get a master's degree in history. He was a farmer, and and so and so he gets into the field. I won't say late in life, but he gets in later in life. And but because he had been a farmer for 20 plus years at the time, he could speak their language.
Yeah.
And he was a Civil War reenactor as well, so he could speak that language. And he was a volunteer firefighter, and the Bentonville Volunteer Fire Department is like the lifeblood of the community now. And so all those things made Donnie perfect for his role, for acquiring the property, for people really saw the Donnie as one of them, and so he was perfect. Once when they needed someone um, to to really show the community that that we wanted them to be part of the future of Bentonville as well. Donnie was perfect for that. And so sadly he passed away. I guess it's been almost 3 years now. Time flies, but Donnie's legacy is absolutely strong. And Donnie worked with a lot of folks like Mark Bradley, like Ed Bars, who Ed ventured to Bentonville multiple times, and he helped bring attention to Bentonville. And so, getting the Battlefield Trust or the predecessor organizations really interested in Bentonville. That had happened just before Donnie arrived, but then Donnie was the perfect partner for when they do get on the scenes for being able to to push everyone together. Donnie's method wasn't to go out and tell folks that we want your property. Donnie's method was if you're ever interested in selling, talk to us first, essentially. And and then you would, especially if you're a farmer, you stand a great chance of being able to lease back your own property. You can farm it. You don't have to you no longer have to pay property taxes on it. Um, so it's Donnie, like I said, Donnie was perfect for that time.
Yeah. Derek, as you look ahead to the future of the Bentonville battlefield, what do you hope to see?
Yeah. So I do hope to see Bentonville continue to. We like to think, and under the current manager now, the person who took Donnie's position, Colby Stevens, under Colby's leadership, we are really trying to continue to really try to become a destination battlefield more so than just passing by saw the sign on 95, which we want those folks too.
Oh, yeah.
Please come. We want we want people to come. We want people to come, even if they are just coming to walking trails in the woods to find nature, because you may learn something about the battle while you're there as well. But we really want Bentonville to really become that destination spot. We have some ideas as a few more properties come about, that we can start doing things kind of like enclosed loop of driving trails, similar to like Antietam, similar to Gettysburg. Whereas now our driving tour, which is we have nice tour stops, but it's all adjacent to public roads. But we're starting to get to the point where we may be able to get um, um, uh, even a driving tour off the major highways. And so that's one of those things, and we Bentonville will continue to be a community where people live. So we never have aspirations to own all 6,000 acres of the battlefield, but we really now we're probably 90+% of day one, that we own probably 90+% of day one, which is definitely the most important day of the battle. Day two um, heavy skirmishing, and I'm always very hesitant to say skirmishing. What's a skirmish? What's a battle? If someone's shooting at me, I think it's a battle, right?
Mhm.
Um, yeah. But we've just now been able to put two tour stops for day two, um, and um, and we have both commanders' headquarters where we try to interpret day three, but we need more on that part of the battlefield. So venturing further east, away from the visitor center, doing more away from the visitor center as logistics allow us to do that. That's another goal we have.
Yeah. I will say though, I love your driving tour, and the
Yeah,
tour stops are big. They're
yeah,
convenient. You can get a bus in, which is always
yeah,
good.
yes,
Well
absolutely right.
interpreted. I mean, I love your driving tour a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah. And the cell phone narration really helps. People, some people kind of like I think my first time at Gettysburg, it was the audio tape. The tour stop on tape. But people want us to have CDs. And we started introducing. Well, actually, with this app, you can download narration, but you can actually see maps with it as you're going. Now, because our driving tour is adjacent to the highway. We don't do it turn by turn because someone would get hit by a livestock truck or something like that, or a rock truck. But we do the audio narration from the tour stops themselves, and so some of that could, as we get off the road, some of that could expand it in the future. Um, More walking trails, getting people. We've started putting brigade markers up over the past 10 years where brigades are located. Being able to get at least a single marker for each brigade would
Mm.
be is a goal. Before we start moving into, well, this brigade was here at this point, they're here at this other point. So being able to get a single brigade marker for each brigade is a goal. Also, we are also looking at raising funds to get at least a single reproduction artillery piece for each batter.
Oh,
And
wow.
reproduction artillery, the tubes are expensive enough, but metal carriages, which are great because they last forever. All aluminum carriages, though, cost more than my car does. Literally cost more than my car that I drive the 100 miles round trip every day from my home in Duplin County to Bentonville. Um, so you're talking, they're like 30,000 plus for a aluminum carriage. So it just adds up. Luckily, there wasn't a whole lot of artillery at Bentonville, so it is an attainable goal. There's 21 Union pieces, 20, 24 Union pieces deployed on March 19, and somewhere around now they're starting to be debate, but somewhere between 14 and 18 Confederates on March 19. So it's attainable numbers, and yeah, but I need to go in the cannon business because it looks like hard work, but it's very profitable work. I'll say that. Anyways, yeah, yes,
So, Derek, before we wrap up, we're talking about your book, Bentonville Battlefield State Historic Site from Images America. Any
yeah,
final comments you want to give folks, or any final thoughts about the battlefield?
yeah. Well, yeah, we uh, it was um, it was super interesting learning the research, because like we're saying, nationally, your research is typically on the battle, right? But learning how why our predecessors made the decisions that they did over the years, that was super fascinating. Um, things, things like that. And like we said, this is a images of America book, so it's image based, so it's not super heavy reading, but we think, speaking for we up until recently we had two Colbys, so I want to clear this up. Colby Stevens is the site manager. Colby Lipscomb was my co-worker and co-author of this. Colby's recently left us for a different job in the field, but Colby and I felt like this really kind of closed the gap in the scholarship of people really trying to understand why some of the things, why the historic site made some of the decisions that they did over the years, and why the interpretation is like it is now.
So it's a fantastic book. I thought it was really neat.
Yeah,
It helped me sort of, as I was touring the battlefield, just, I always love that behind the scenes story
yeah,
of the battlefield itself. And it was super illuminating and
yeah. Well,
lots of
we
great
definitely
light
thank
bulbs.
we definitely thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Derrick, thanks for spending some time
All
with
right.
me. And I'm
Well,
I'm
thank
glad
you
you
for having me.
survived the 160th.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I'm gonna go head back to work after vacation tomorrow, and we'll see what final pieces from the 160th are still laying about. And before too long, we'll be talking about the 165th. Yeah, yeah,
Please give your colleagues my best and say hi to Anna and Colby
yeah,
and
definitely will.
all right, pal. I'm Chris Mikowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.
Thank you, guys.